In the early 1920s, a new science was born in the Soviet Union. Under the guidance of its founding father, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, young engineers launched their first rockets. One of them was Sergei Korolyov, who later became chief designer of the Soviet rocket and space industry. Research was interrupted during the Stalinist purges and did not get underway again until the end of World War II. By then, Nazi Germany had developed the V-2 rocket. Although it never played a decisive role in the war, this missile was of great interest to both the USA and the Soviet Union. While the Americans were concentrating on getting hold of the top German engineers, Soviet and German engineers in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany got production of the V-2s going again. In 1947, the Soviet Union launched its first missiles from sites in the Russian steppes near Volgograd. And a few years later, the Soviets, ahead of the Americans, already had a long-range carrier rocket capable of carrying nuclear warheads. But Korolyov refused to abandon his idea of using rockets for non-military purposes, and he found a political ally in the person of Nikita Khrushchev. On the 4th of October 1957, the first Sputnik was launched. Developing a rocket for manned spaceflight required a mammoth input of material and human resources. On the 12th of April 1961, the first human to go into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, was launched in a Vostok 1. The conquest of the cosmos had begun. Yuri Gagarin's successful flight, 2 weeks ahead of the first American astronauts, is a tremendous challenge for the USA. President John F. Kennedy reacts immediately and announces his program on the 25th of May.
Extraordinary challenge. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Kennedy's speech marks the beginning of the race between the superpowers to get to the moon. It sets a deadline for the US space program, the end of the decade. On the 5th of May 1961, Alan Shepard had been launched into space from Florida. His flight in a Mercury capsule had lasted 15 minutes. But for major developments in space exploration, the world is still watching the Soviet Union. Here in August, German Titov remains 24 hours in orbit, circling the Earth 17 times. Titov in East Berlin in an open motorcar with Walter Ulbricht. This step towards the stars is a truly crowd-moving event, and the cheers seem to be genuine. Political leaders take advantage of the event for their own purposes. February 1962. John Glenn has orbited the Earth 3 times, giving America its own reason to celebrate. From now on, things happen at a rapid pace, with Soviets and Americans pushing penetration into space a bit further each time. Valentina Tereshkova is another Trump asset for Khrushchev's propaganda. The first woman in space, a Soviet Russian. The 4 days she spends in orbit, circling the Earth 48 times, set a new record. The conversation between the lady cosmonaut and the General Secretary runs like a well-prepared script and provides wonderful slogans for the propaganda machine. Tereshkova greets all communists and their party, and Khrushchev praises her as a brave Soviet woman. It is interesting to note that the conversation is not shown on Soviet television until after Tereshkova's successful landing. Continued exploration of space requires a new, stronger rocket. In the Soviet Union, work is progressing on the powerful Voskhod. Pressure is considerable, as once again the goal is to beat the Americans, who are working intensively on the Gemini program. A cosmonaut team is quickly put together in Baikonur. The crew consists of the military pilot Komarov, the physician Yegorov, and the engineer Feoktistov.
1934 года. Тогда в докладе Королёва были такие слова.
Korolev supervises the last preparation stages personally. It is a risky flight. Having an additional crew member, the third man Feoktistov, means that the entire emergency rescue system has had to be restructured to provide the extra space. There are neither spacesuits nor ejector seats for the landing on board. The goals of this flight were never made public. The cosmonauts are fully aware of the risks, and they also suspect who is really behind the project. I asked myself, why? Where does this idea come from? And why is Korolev so intent on doing this? What do we really need this for? I think we were after sensationalism the whole time. Look at us, we're flying more. And then it dawned on me that somebody must be pressuring him from above. Look, the Americans are doing this and that, and what about you? You have to work harder, so that the Americans don't overtake us. A lot of people thought that Khrushchev was behind the idea. On the 12th of October 1964, Voskhod 1 takes off, but it is brought back to Earth after only 1 day in space. March 1965. In the Voskhod 2 capsule, Alexei Leonov and Pavel Belyayev are getting ready for a special adventure, a man leaving the spacecraft for the first time. The Soviet Union needs a propaganda victory against the USA, where the Gemini program is about to get underway. But the technical system enabling a cosmonaut to leave the capsule, shown here in an animated version, is far from being fault-free. Voskhod 2's flight is probably the riskiest venture of the entire Soviet space program. Alexei Leonov, the first man free-floating in space, tethered to the spacecraft by no more than a thin supply line. The problems connected with this flight did not become known until a few years ago. In the vacuum of space, Leonov's spacesuit expands and he is only barely able to re-enter the capsule. A short while later, the retro-rockets fail during re-entry, so that after an additional orbit, the cosmonauts have to fire them manually to get back to Earth. The capsule lands somewhere in Siberia. The men are not found for a whole day. The strain of the flight is clearly visible in their faces. Like Vostok before it, Voskhod is beset by problems that finally lead to the premature termination of the program. There were 6 Vostok launches in all. In the end, we engineers refused to continue working on Vostok. It is true that there were a lot of people who wanted to go on, people who were after quick fame. But we had understood that the rocket's design was dangerous. In the rocket workshops, the new Soyuz spaceship is taking shape. Its goal is clearly formulated: landing on the moon. Officially, however, the plan is denied for years. Landing on the moon was never declared to be a defined program. Vladimir Komarov is being trained for the first launch of the new system. Korolev dies in January 1966. On this occasion, the world and the Soviet public get to see a photograph of the designer for the first time. His successor is the rocket design engineer Vasily Mishin. The cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. In April 1967, Soyuz 1 is finally ready for launch. But then for technical reasons, the space capsule is recalled after only 1 day. During the landing maneuver, recovery parachutes fail to open and the capsule shatters on the ground. For the past 2 years, Leonid Brezhnev has been Secretary General of the Communist Party. As economic pressures mount, political interest in space exploration declines sharply during his leadership. But in spite of the many difficulties, the programs continue unabated. The goal is still the moon.
Группу
U-4 was conceived as a moon landing program, a different spaceship, a different crew, and a different carrier rocket. We also started preparations straight away. The program involved a new rocket, the N1.
Значит, начали мы тоже подготовку в этой программе. Программа была рассчитана на новую ракету, ракета N1.
Between August and November 1968, American espionage satellites discover a new rocket in Baikonur. NASA Administrator James Webb warns Congress about the competition of a Russian super-rocket on the way to the moon. The N1 looks amazingly similar to the American Saturn V. It has almost the same thrust and carries the same payload. But it never gets beyond the testing phase. The usefulness of Chief Engineer Mishin's project is still disputed today. Mishin, having no successes to offer, is replaced in 1972. But in the meantime, the Americans are ready to launch. On the 16th of July 1969, Apollo 11 is launched from Cape Canaveral. Its destination? The moon. Five days later, the world watches with bated breath as Neil Armstrong and Edward Aldrin land the Eagle on the Sea of Tranquility. A triumph for the USA, live on television for the whole Western world to see. The race to the moon has been won.
Of course, we were excited in July '69
when we learned that Apollo had landed on the moon and that the first man to step on the moon was carrying an American flag. A great pity it wasn't a Soviet flag.
Очень жаль, что это был не советский флаг.
The Soviet Union has lost the race to the moon. Scientists on both sides are now thinking about new goals, and technicians are working on concepts for new spaceflight programs. The first rocket generations are outdated. The Soviets are now working on powerful rocket engines for operations leading even further afield. While in Moscow, Academy of Sciences President Mstislav Keldysh declares that manned moon flights are being postponed for an indefinite period, 3 men are preparing for an unusual experiment. In an isolation test, they want to gather information on long-term stays in space. Soviet space plans are now concentrating on the development of systems for large-scale orbital stations. Yet another, further-reaching step into space. Ever since Gagarin's flight, public interest had concentrated exclusively on manned space exploration. All along, however, there had been a parallel program of systematic research involving unmanned satellites and automatic probes. In early 1966, Luna 9 had landed on the moon and transmitted the first data regarding the lunar surface back to Earth. 3 months later, Luna 10 had been sent to orbit the moon. As there were no other space successes to celebrate at the time, the probe had been used for propaganda purposes. The 22nd Congress listened politely to the satellite's croaking melody. At the time, Brezhnev used Luna 10 for his own purposes, but he was also able to stress the importance of cosmic predominance and formulate his expectations clearly. This is what we were told again and again, at all levels, right up to the Defense Council. Brezhnev even told the Council of the Ministry of Defense, if we seem to be behind in space and rocket technology, if the Americans have something, no matter what, and we don't have it, and are left behind, then I'll have you all put up against the wall.
Американцы будут иметь, понимаете, комплексы, а мы нет, и мы будем здесь, будем отставать, мы вас к стенке поставим.
In spite of the political pressure, the space industry has been fraught with problems permanently since 1966. It is not until January 1969 that it can present a new success finally, with the rendezvous and docking of Soyuz 4 and 5, as shown here in an animated version. During the 35th orbit, 2 cosmonauts transfer from one capsule to the other. A few days later, the first experimental space station gets effusive coverage in the Soviet press. After the experience gathered with Soyuz 4 and 5, 3 new crews are sent into intensive training at the same time. The list of tasks set for this mission is ambitious and extensive, and the training program is tough. While Alexei Yeliseyev practices with welding equipment, Vladislav Volkov is filming. Working in spacesuits and under weightless conditions is practiced underwater. Used by the program since 1963, the SL-4 carrier rocket with the Soyuz 6 spaceship on the way to the launching pad. Georgy Shonin and Valery Kubasov are the first of the 3 cosmonaut crews taking off from Baikonur on the 11th of October 1969. The SL-4's massive thrust lifts the 6.5-ton spacecraft into orbit within 9 minutes, more than 200 kilometers. A complex endeavor of this sort requires tremendous reliability and technical precision. Ground station conditions at the time are still a far cry from the possibilities and the routine which are usual today. The task of Soyuz 6, 7 and 8 was for 2 of them to dock in space, while the third circled the docking ships to photograph the operation, plus a whole lot of experiments, welding and other technical and biological experiments, things that are done on all other flights too.
Стартом ракет и другие, как всегда, много технических, биологических всяких экспериментов.
One day after the Soyuz 6 launch, the next crew, Volkov, Filipchenko and Gorbatko, take off. The crew of Soyuz 7 in flight. At approximately 26,000 kilometers per hour, the spaceships orbit the Earth. Life on board is nothing like the relative luxury of modern space stations. Many things are improvised and are more reminiscent of a Boy Scout camp than a high-tech spacecraft. In addition to the usual tasks of reviewing manual flight systems and making necessary course corrections, each crew has special tasks to fulfill. Biomedical experiments for Soyuz 6, geographic exploration of the Earth and its atmosphere for Soyuz 7. Volkov during a gymnastics break. 3 days later, Soyuz 8 follows with cosmonauts Shatalov and Yeliseyev on board. In the course of the next few days, the 3 spaceships execute course corrections and rendezvous maneuvers. Amazingly, no actual docking takes place, although this was originally intended as part of the spaceship's mission. While the USA was able to use its global network of electronic surveillance to communicate with its spaceships, the Soviets had to find other possibilities. They built an entire fleet of radar ships, which, deployed on the high seas, ensured communication with orbiting cosmonauts. State reception in Moscow for the returning Soyuz crews. Space exploration must still serve the political system by providing it with a demonstration of power. Of course, only successes are celebrated, and everything else remains cloaked in total secrecy. By now, the development of unmanned stations has come a long way. After the lost race to the moon, the possibilities and prospects of unmanned space exploration had been discussed with increased intensity. With Luna 16, launched in September 1970, the Soviets succeed in soft landing a spacecraft on the moon and bringing lunar material back to Earth. At last, Moscow can boast of having extraterrestrial matter of its own. It no longer has to depend on gifts from the Americans. Compared with the manned US lunar program, Luna 16 is a considerably cheaper and lower risk undertaking. In Moscow, it is celebrated as the true Soviet moon program. Shortly after the Luna 16 flight, the remote-controlled lunokhod roves the lunar surface and transmits countless photographs and data back to Earth. In the USA, fascination for the moon has already ebbed, and this mission now also marks the end of the Soviets' interest in lunar exploration. At the same time, the 3 test candidates end their stay in the isolation ward of the Medical Space Center. During the 1-year test, the men have lived in conditions approaching those of a space station. The medical problems connected with long-term stays in space are still unknown. And in addition to the need for reliable technology, the human element is still the weakest point. These tests are only the first experimental steps. Real difficulties will not come up until true long-term spaceflight. In long flights, we had several problems to cope with. You could say this was a totally new kind of flying. Everything from the psychological situation to the adjustment of body organs to unusual conditions, cardiovascular functions, the respiratory system. We also had to find solutions for a number of problems related to preventive measures in connection with long-term weightlessness.
До вопросов профилактики вот этого длительного воздействия невесомости на организм человека.
The latest Soyuz missions are all successful. The 18-day flight of Soyuz 9, almost 4 days longer than the recent record set by Gemini 7, provides important information on the influence of weightlessness on the human body. These successes have a distinct effect on future developments, the preparation of the new Salyut program. Here we see the final components being mounted on the Salyut space station. It is the start of a program which will operate successfully for more than 15 years. Konstantin Feoktistov played a major role in the formulation of the aims and in the construction of the space station. Discussions about the future direction to be taken by development efforts had begun early, mainly in my group, still at the time when we were all working on the Vostok project. We knew that to stay on the crest of progress, we had to choose an ambitious goal. Some people said, off to Mars. Others said, we must fly to the moon. And the third group, that was, well, let's say that was only me really. I said we had to work on an orbital station, because we should be taking things one step at a time.
В единственном числе, третий,
скажем, это я, надо работать над орбитальными станциями, потому что надо двигаться последовательно.
The experience gathered during the last Soyuz missions flows directly into the design and equipment planning of the space station. These scenes show cosmonauts Nikolaev and Volkov at work. Although both are experienced military pilots, they also have a solid background in engineering. Special care is taken in the development and testing of the control system for manual and automatic docking between the Salyut space station and the Soyuz spacecraft. The Salyut 1 space station is launched on the 19th of April 1971. The carrier rocket for the 18.5-ton station is an SL-13, the new 4-stage Proton rocket.
Георгий Добровольский,
After the unsuccessful Soyuz 10 mission, whose failure has never been explained, all hopes are based on Soyuz 11. The crew members are Volkov, Dobrovolsky and Patsayev. At this point, no one knows that Soyuz 11 will become the greatest tragedy in the history of Soviet space exploration.
Наилучшим техническим решением было бы создание постоянной.
The crew's mission is to transfer to the space station and to check its systems. After the docking maneuver, the station is to be steered into a higher orbit. It had had problems during its flight into orbit and had lost altitude and was nearing the critical minimum flight altitude of 200 kilometers. The crew succeed in stabilizing Salyut and in bringing it up to an orbiting altitude of 259 kilometers. After 24 days in space, the longest stay so far, re-entry begins. The maneuver ends in tragedy. A sudden leak in the capsule robs the crew of breathing air during the landing maneuver. The 3 men suffocate. After the deaths of Komarov and Gagarin, killed in a plane crash in 1969, the death of the 3 Soyuz 11 cosmonauts is the greatest loss suffered by the Soviet space program. Until today, the development of the rocket and space industry is in the hands of the rocket troops of the Red Army. The development of manned stations, such as Salyut, are of particular interest for the military. Between 1972 and 1976, 4 Almaz stations with purely military aims are launched from Baikonur. The station was very well built. It had technical possibilities that are still unique today. The station was made for espionage, for investigations with optical systems, cameras for high-precision Earth photography, for onboard evaluation of the results, and transmission to Earth.
Если в мирных целях, пожалуйста, исследования природных ресурсов, всего фото, киносъемка Земли, передача с борта на Землю результатов киносъемки.
Because of the severe cuts in defense budgets after 1974, but also because of the development of more effective automatic systems, there are no further military launches of orbital stations after 1976. The Almaz stations still in orbit are crashed and burn out in the atmosphere. According to expert estimates, almost 80% of space activities and discoveries are directly or indirectly controlled by the military, or at least useful for military purposes, in both East and West. Although Soviet space experts had always insisted on the high safety standards of their technology, there were nevertheless serious faults. Rescue systems for the cosmonauts' capsules were not developed until the end of the 1960s. In the critical first 2 minutes of a launch, such systems make it possible to eject the capsule of a defective rocket away from the danger zone. the 30th of June 1983. Soyuz T-10, carrying cosmonauts Titov and Strekalov. Since the Soyuz 11 catastrophe in 1971, crews have worn spacesuits for all takeoff and landing maneuvers. This has meant, however, that the capsules have had space for only 2 cosmonauts. One of the engines of the SL-4 rocket explodes during takeoff. Within seconds, the launching pad is engulfed in flames as the fuel tanks explode one after the other. The powerful explosion also ignites the rescue system, shooting the cosmonauts clear of the inferno. The next day, a press declaration is given about the unsuccessful takeoff. By now, openness is the order of the day. Ever since the difficult landing of Soyuz 18 in 1975, the world is informed more and more often of Moscow's plans and problems. This historic process is the work of Brezhnev and Nixon and the SALT I disarmament treaty. In the course of the 1970s, the superpowers have gradually grown closer, encouraged by the thought that on the long term, cooperation is a better problem solver than confrontation. Brezhnev and Nixon agree on disarmament measures and establish a joint space program to show the world that their policy of understanding is serious. The joint Soyuz-Apollo project shows the extent to which propaganda still plays a role in space exploration.
Сюда прибыла группа американских
The
астронавтов
mission's 2
во
teams
главе с
meet
бригадным
in Moscow
генералом
in May
Томасом
1975.
Стаффордом.
The astronauts Stafford, Brand and Slayton and the cosmonauts Leonov and
Американские и
Kubasov.
советские космонавты
For the
проведут в нашей
first time,
стране совместные
foreign
тренировки
visitors are
по
admitted to the
программе
Baikonur
«Аполлон-Союз».
Space Center. The crews during training. The cosmonauts take off in an atmosphere of openness never experienced before. It is the first time that the Soviet population can follow the takeoff preparations and the launch live on television. At the same time, footage of the launch is broadcast worldwide.
We have ignition.
A few hours after Soyuz 19, the Saturn rocket carrying Apollo 18 takes off on the 15th of July, 1975. 2 days later, the world witnesses the docking of the 2 spaceships. This historic meeting, 225 kilometers above the Earth, is also a symbol for a new political climate, an openness which has continued until today. In 1969, the first Intercosmos satellite involving the participation of several countries had been launched from Kapustin Yar. Intercosmos had been founded in 1965 as a confederation of the 8 other socialist countries and the Soviet Union. Some of the member states had their own space programs. In other cases, concrete scientific and technical experiments were carried out for Soviet projects. After the Soyuz Apollo flight, it was only a question of time until the first foreign cosmonaut took part in a Soviet flight. After the Czech cosmonaut Remek, the Polish officer Hermaszewski takes off from Baikonur in June 1978. By now, more than 1,000 satellites had been launched into space from the 3 Soviet launching sites. The former GDR also participates in the Intercosmos program right from its inception, working on instruments for measuring and analysis. 2 months after Hermaszewski, Zygmunt Jähn, a pilot of the National People's Army, takes part in a space mission.
Wir hatten, wie gesagt, die
We had, as I said, the MKF-6 multispectral camera, a semi-automatic camera which produced high-resolution photos for that time. It is still in the station today, by the way. It's a camera that has proved itself for its special tasks. We carried out experiments with cameras, 6x6 cameras. A special method had been devised at the former Institute of Earth Physics in Potsdam. And together with the scientists of this institute, I worked on the preparations and on the evaluation. This work was an important component, and it brought the whole thing forwards a good way, finding methods for visual and instrumental observation of Earth from space. In a water basin at the Star City Space Center near Moscow, cosmonauts train on a model of the new space station Salyut 6. The aim is to systematically extend stays on the station. Stays of up to 1 year are already being organized. Training in the water tank simulates conditions for repair work outside the station. The cosmonauts wear the suits they will be using for work in space.
В специальном бассейне в состоянии гидроневесомости отрабатывают они технику работы в открытом космосе.
Engineers had long been looking for inexpensive and reusable transport possibilities for regular supply trips to the space stations. In May 1987, after 10 years of development work, the space shuttle Buran is rolled to the launching pad at Baikonur for the first time. You can't imagine our situation at the time. This task required totally new materials and technology. It took all our efforts to succeed. We were told what we had to do, and that we had to take what was already there to do it. But it wasn't that simple, you understand? Our chemists had to develop new synthetic materials, new adhesives, new materials. All of the country's possibilities had to be used for this work. How else were we supposed to produce such a thing? Just like that. Just make it.
Вот в чем вопрос весь. Как же упускать такое, что вы понимаете?
The discussion about technical and qualitative differences between the American space shuttle and Buran must be left to the experts. Buran flew only once, with high technical precision. However, the shuttle's costs and the country's economic troubles led to the abandonment of the program. Moreover, experts had never developed a feasible cost-benefit concept for a reusable space shuttle. Together with Buran, the carrier rocket Energia, built for a payload of 150 tons, is also scrapped, and an entire industry suddenly faces unemployment. All of them were specialists, experienced people. Now they've all left. A great shame. The team has totally disintegrated. The qualifications, the knowledge. They had studied so long. And Buran was like our child. We were really in love with the project. And this work, well, it's really a pity.
Это вообще у нас был наше детище такое. Знаете, мы были прям влюблены все в него, в эту работу, ждали. Обидно, конечно.
Since the early 1980s, the political and economic crisis of the Soviet Union has been increasingly apparent. General secretaries follow each other in quick succession, without being able to halt the disintegration of the country. More and more, space travel, so long the pet project of the top political brass, must look inwards and be answerable for its economic feasibility. With the Mir space station, a new quality of manned station has been achieved. As a base for new international projects, Mir points the way to the future. For the first time, a gigantic and qualified industry is attempting to orient itself according to the laws of the Western market economy. A challenge the stars of Soviet cosmonautics will have to learn to face.
Во-первых, конечно, испытываешь восхищение.
You have a
перед
feeling of
мирозданием.
wonder looking at the world,
Восхищение перед
at the
вот
beauty and
красотой и
diversity of
сложностью
everything
того, что
around
нас
you.
окружает.
Then you feel admiration for the human genius
Во-вторых,
that created something
испытываешь
so
восхищение
fantastic,
перед гением человека,
sending a
который
representative
сумел
into the
сделать, можно
cosmos,
сказать,
overcoming all
недостижимое.
these
То есть сумел
difficulties.
отправить представителя своего в космос, преодолев такие сложности.
In Russia, heir of the Soviet rubble heap, no one is seriously considering giving up space travel. Of course, power calculations have something to do with this. Space travel will never be quite free of political considerations. But at the same time, modern spaceflight offers a myriad of technical possibilities. Global communication systems, environmental protection, the development of new materials, pharmaceutical products of utmost purity, to name only a few. Whether the end justifies the financial means, what is play and what is serious research, these are aspects difficult for outsiders to judge.
На наших станциях
Cosmonauts on our stations worked efficiently, some of them up to 1 year. We have learned how to live there, how to work there. That is a result. The main point is a question we haven't asked yet. Why do we need man up there at all? What has man effectively achieved up there?
Чем же там они занимались эффективно?
Work on the Mir space station has become routine, and stays of 1 year or more are no longer unusual. Soon, American space shuttles with Russian and international crews will be docking there. A Cosmograd complex is being planned for 20 scientists. Flights to other planets are also a concrete possibility. Whether such endeavors are more than a mere technical challenge, we may know in a few years. In terms of interplanetary flights, we are now concentrating on Mars. We had a good lunar program, but to Mars, this is a very difficult mission. We have to carry it out, in spite of the difficulties involved with financing. The 22nd of October of this year is the only possibility for a launch. Otherwise, everything will be thrown back 2 years. 15 countries are participating in the work. The Americans have lost interest in Mars. That's another reason why it's the next goal for us. The avenue of cosmonauts in Moscow, Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova, once upon a time the stars among Soviet cosmonauts. Gagarin was the first who turned the dream of the human conquest of the cosmos into reality, together with Sergei Korolev. Their heritage now faces its greatest challenge, greater than the way to Mars, its own future.